Hello everybody and welcome to another Wednesday video. Today we're going to go back even further in time than we have previously on this channel. We're going back before the age of shipborne artillery to the age of the good old ramming and boarding action in the ancient world. And today's guest to talk about that is, and apologies immediately if I get this entirely wrong, but Peter Freiherr von Danckelman. Is that vaguely in the ballpark of being correct?
Yes, I do think so. In German, the pronunciation would be Peter Freiherr von Danckelman, but well, it's totally fine for you.
You at least know what I'm talking about.
Yes, definitely.
Good. Right. So, yeah, if you just give yourself a little bit of an introduction, so we know who we're talking to for everybody else.
Yes, I am a PhD student in classics at the Karl von Ossietzky Universität Oldenburg. And since we are currently in coronavirus, my boss decided that we should do an online class about the Persian Wars, within which I came to do a lot of the military stuff because my master thesis was about ancient military in Israel, and so I did something for the Greeks as well, and also I'm part-time author and of alternate history novels, and that's the way how I found your channel.
Okay, cool. Right, so we'll get started on the on the questions themselves, and obviously where there's odd random bits of audio, we can obviously always edit them out. It's fine. Just out of interest before we go on, and obviously I'll edit this bit out, do you have a copy of your master's thesis that you'd be willing to share?
Yes, but I feel it's in German, so I can send it to you, no problem.
Yeah, I can give it a go at either reading it or getting someone to translate it for me.
Yes.
I retain some ability to read it, but that would be really interesting. I quite like reading about the ancient military of the Middle East.
Yeah, so yeah, no problem. I can send you that.
Cool. Okay, right. So, on to the main questions then. So, first question is, since we're going back even further than the basic shipborne artillery, presumably this leaves us with the tactics of boarding, ramming, and man-portable missile weaponry, archers and slingers and such as the primary methods of naval combat. So, for the period that we're talking about, which is the Persian-Greek wars and that surrounding area, where did things stand with relation to shipborne combat tactics around about when Persia starts to make serious moves on Greece?
Well, yes, that's the interesting question here, because you've got basically all three tactics interconnected, of course. I would presume that your first and foremost choice would be ramming, because, well, nearly every warship of that period is fitted with a ram, and before you can board somebody, you'll have to negotiate your way through the enemy's ram anyhow. So the action would start with the ships trying to ram each other most of the time, and then it comes down what kind of tactic the helmsman prefers. Like, if you've got a very skilled crew with good oarsmen and a good helmsman, you can try to ram the enemy's ship, but then back away again. Like, you wouldn't ram full speed, but try to slow down before impact so that you can not have the difficulty of overextending your ram and getting stuck in the enemy hull. If the hull gets tangled up, you'll start boarding. For boarding, you've got maybe 10 Marines on each ship, on each major warship, so not too many guys. And it could cleanly happen that the ship that was rammed won the boarding engagement, and, well, everybody climbed over to the new ship and sailed away happily ever after. Or the ship that won the ramming duel could capture the ship that was boarded. With man-portable missile weapons, well, we've got only archery and spear throwers, so to speak. Maybe 3 to 4 guys per ship, and well, those could have quite a big impact. For example, if one lucky shot managed to hit the enemy's helmsman, then that might give you a very good chance to ram a ship that is out of control. But mostly they would be used for preparing a boarding action, maybe to help in when an allied ship is in a boarding and you could give fire support from the sides, or a very gruesome thing like if a ship was boarded, most men on board would be unarmed, like the rowers would be nearly naked and carry no weapons at all, so those guys would go overboard if necessary and if they knew that their guys were losing on deck. And so you tended to have quite a lot of swimmers around in the water, and we can presume that archers would have quite the happy time sniping those poor guys in the water off if they thought they were enemies.
Okay, so if a ship is taken, then it wouldn't the galley, or I suppose they're not really galleys at this point, but the rowers are not going to be necessarily willing to comply with the new ship's owners.
No, not in general. Like, there are times where people are taken prisoners, of course, but most battles are fought in coastal waters. So if you could at all swim, you could just hop overboard and try to get away from them.
I suppose that makes a distinction between the rowers of this period and the rowers of some nations and some ships in later periods, because presumably then these people are usually not slaves or prisoners. They're presumably free crew.
Yes, indeed. Like, we have very scarce evidence of some Athenian crews of the Peloponnesian Wars that they're partially slaves, like maybe a third or so of a crew, but normally in a warship of that era you would have 3 people on the rows, on the oars, like the majority of a ship, 170 out of 200 people would be rowers, and you couldn't really control that many people on an ancient warships that were slaves and unwilling to comply. So you needed to have people that were there for their own sake and knew what they did for the thing, the city, or whatever they fought for.
Okay, yeah. I suppose that's a big contrast then, as opposed to later periods when the number of slaves and such like tended to increase, and it became a lot less of a, I guess, a prestige job.
Well, definitely. Like, I know in the 15th or 16th century you'd have galley slaves, and presumably every time a galley was captured you could just free the guys which were on your side or had been on your side and put the enemy right onto the oar again, but that would very rarely happen for an ancient fleet.
Fair enough. So, speaking of the ancient fleets, what were the primary ships involved on both sides at this point in time, and who is sailing or manning them in terms of sort of, is this kind of, if it's the Athenian navy, is it Athenians who are manning them, or the Persian navy, is it Persians, or are they using vassals and such like?
So for the ships we can differentiate quite a few types of warships that were used. Like, there are a few little ships like pentacores, so 50 oar ships with 50 rowers, and biremes, so 2-story ships where there are 2 stacks of rowers, one above the other. But the primary fighting ship of the day is the triere, or trireme in English. So that's 3 decks of rowers stacked one on top of the other. And well, that's the standard ship for nearly the whole of the Eastern Mediterranean for doing battle. You would use the smaller ships maybe for raiding actions, for reconnaissance or stuff like that, but it's the trireme for battle. Mm-hmm. And in in terms of manning, well, that's quite the distinction between the Athenians and the Persians. Like in Athens, we are in the process of building up really that large fleet, because Athens only recently had acquired the money to build quite a lot of triremes, and they would simply use the poor population of the city, the so-called thetes. That would be people who were previously unable to do any military service, because in ancient Greek you had to provide your own equipment, and a hoplite panoply is awfully expensive for the time. So you would need to be at least middle class to be in a phalanx formation, but for rowing, well, you only need the muscles, and those poor land working classes had the muscles, so they were in for the rowing action. Then you would have a corps of sailors, like maybe 10 or so guys who would manipulate rudder and, if you had the weather, the sails. So that might have been professional sailors from the merchant navy of the day. And the marines would be taken from the hoplite guys, from the land army, if you like. So maybe just adjust your armor a little bit, don't wear too much bronze, I guess, and then you're good to serve there. And the top upper class guys, like the very, very rich guys, would actually form the guys called triarchs, like commander of a ship. You would give a certain amount of money to keeping it up, and therefore you would get to sit in a throne on the stern of a ship and act as if you're the commander of the whole thing. But well, since your helmsman is the guy who is already doing the maneuvers, and he basically would have to know very much more about the ship than you did, it's more like a position of honor, but not so much one of command.
Fair enough.
If you go up to the Persians, the picture changes somewhat. Like, Persians and Medes themselves are basically no seagoing people at that time at all, but they would send in some marines to help and to control some unwilling crews, maybe, but mostly the crews and the ships would be from vassal states on the Mediterranean coast. Basically, you can take a map and go up from Egypt via Cyprus, the whole Levant with the Phoenicians in it, and then what's today Turkey with Carians and Ionians. So that would be the people who would man the ships of a Persian fleet in that time. Mostly with a few Persian marines and some Persian admirals, so to speak, like the one odd brother or cousin of a great king who would be sent with them to, well, act as if you knew what he did and command.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully he'd listen to the people who actually knew what they were doing.
Well, yes, and we know that the great king himself even did sometimes do like big sitting-ins with all naval commanders, and then asked them for what they think he should do, and then listened to their words more or less. But yeah, normally the single files within the Persian fleet would be commanded by local noblemen or even the king itself of that region, and those guys typically knew what they were doing quite well, because if you're a Phoenician king, well, that's basically what you have to do. And if you do not know that, well, you won't be king very long.
Fair enough. Give me 2 seconds, I've just got to... yes, that doesn't surprise me. Sorry, I just noticed a sudden drop in the computer's performance, and it was Steam trying to download an update. So, okay, right, that's sorted. Right, so yeah, obviously edit this little section out. Okay, so when we've got these fleets going on both sides, some of the histories of the period often talk about vast armies and fleets. So when Xerxes invades Greece, they talk about a million men coming in and such like, and commensurately the fleet is described as being equally large. Are these numbers that are portrayed on both sides for the navies actually realistic? And whether or not that is the case, what was the actual true size of the fleets on both sides?
Well, we definitely can say that those numbers are quite unrealistic. Like, Herodotus counts for the fleet of Xerxes in 480 around 1,200 triremes and an addition of 3,000 lighter ships to, well, do some other things. And, well, if we can just add up the numbers up, that would be 200 guys per trireme. No, it's not very likely that the Persian army and navy combined would even approach this size in pure manpower. In terms of how big the fleet actually was, we are, well, in a bit of a conundrum, because the only reference point we do have are the Greeks, the free Greeks, so to speak, and at Salamis we can guess they were around 300 ships strong. Like, we've got references from the play The Persians by Aeschylus, and since Aeschylus was at Salamis and nearly all of his viewers were also veterans of that battle, we can assume that he got that number right. So I would guess that at the start of a campaign, the Persians may have had around 600 ships per battle, then lost quite a lot of them in some storms and other actions, so that at Salamis maybe it's 400 Persian ships, around that number, against the 300 around that Greeks.
Which is, yeah, it's still a large number of ships, but obviously we've got to remember that even with the high crew numbers, these ships are not large as we might conceive of them in later eras of wooden warships.
Not really. I mean, it's trireme maybe 36 to 40 meters long, so, and we have 4 or 5 meters broad, so you can still manage to get a trireme up a beach every night, because, well, you can't sleep on that damn thing, not with 200 people. But well, still, it's also quite the ecological impact to build that many ships in, well, short time. And you already had to see where your supplies came from. Like in a bit later times, the woods of Macedon played a very important role for Athens to supply the timbers and also the ores. So, well, it did their toll on the local woods to build triremes, because those damn thing also rot away quite quickly. So, unless like the Victory, which you could take into battle for 50 years with some refits in and out, you'd be very happy to find any trireme that lasts longer than 25 years.
Okay, so just because say one generation of a particular nation has a fleet of a given size, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to hold true even 40, 50 years down the line, because they will have all rotted away unless they've been steadily replacing them.
Yes, replace them, get them out of the water, and then find the money to actually do the repairs you need to do. And even then, you would always have, in the later Athenian navy, several classes of ships. Like, the first class would be the fastest, then there would be like regular bunch of ships to do the fighting, and then there would be some old ships in reserve, and you wouldn't want to use them unless you needed to.
Okay. Yeah, slightly more fragile at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So How did naval combat evolve during the Persian Wars? Was it the same at the end or as at the beginning, or were there advanced tactics and techniques that were developed during the various encounters that the fleets had during that sort of arc of conflict?
Well, in terms of shipbuilding, well, we know so little about the ships themselves, so that's not something we can answer very well. In terms of tactics and other things, we can see some advancement. For example, well, in terms of naval combat, actually crossing bigger spaces of sea like the Hellespont would actually be very much advanced after the Persian Wars, because the Persians built 2 or 3 large bridges with pontoon bridges with ships in them, presumably over the Hellespont and the Danube, so that definitely helped their skill in that regard. We also can see some very clever strategic thinking from the Persian side during that time. For example, once an expeditionary fleet of Darius actually, well, was wiped out at the coast of the today's peninsula of Athos in the Chalkidika region. So when Xerxes started his invasion, he actually ordered to dug a canal across that peninsula so that when his fleet came along, they could just simply avoid going around the peninsula, but rather used the canal for that. And we can also at least assume that there were some tactical nuities, like at the Battle of Artemisium, that's the action fought parallel to the Battle of Thermopylae.
Mm-hmm.
We see the Greeks deploying in a formation called kyklos. That's ring, translated, and it basically means that if you've got quite a smaller fleet than the enemy, you would form up your triremes in a circle with rams facing outwards, so that the enemy couldn't win your flank and roll you up. So that would be quite the innovation for smaller fleets. And we can also see some kind of innovation in not in direct sea battle, but in fleet engagement nevertheless, that the later battles of the Persian Wars, most notably that of Mycale and of Eurymedon, comprised not only of sea battles, but also of land battles, that like one enemy fleet would be entrenched on the beach, so you'd land your marines and conquer them from land if they didn't want to come out for battle.
Oh, I see. I suppose that is a key difference between this period and later periods, because obviously, yeah, if you catch an enemy fleet in port in the later periods, they're still physically afloat, so it might be confined waters, but it's still going to be a fight. Whereas, yeah, at this period, if their version of in port is literally our vessels are up on a beach somewhere, or if your vessels are afloat, you can't actually do anything to them. But if you land troops, you can then set fire to them or something like that.
Exactly. Like we also have some battles in port, like in the Peloponnesian Wars when Athens tried to conquer the Greek city of Syracuse on Sicily.
Mm-hmm.
There was the great fights in the harbor itself, so in quite confined waters, but that was after both sides basically agreed, yes, the other one is coming out for battle, let's do that also. But if one side refused, and well, you could still row up to the beach and try to tow some ships away or something, or set fire to them otherwise by landing parties. But mostly you had to land troops if the other guys didn't want to come out to fight you on sea.
Okay, fair. So, just. Okay, sorry. Again, I'll just edit this little bit out. So, Try again. So in the context of these evolving tactics and the fleet sizes that we mentioned that are probably more realistic for something like Salamis, was a battle like Salamis, where you've got this sort of smaller Greek force overcoming a substantially larger Persian force, was that the exception? Or in the course of these wars, would you generally expect smaller Greek forces to overcome the Persian navy?
Well, you have to see Salamis within the broadest strategy of the three Greeks of that time. They tried to fend off that big invasion of Xerxes by always combining land forces and sea forces. So they looked for confined situations on both land and sea. Like at Artemision, you've got quite the small passage for waters, and then obviously you've got Thermopylae as the very narrow pass to block the Persians off. And if one position was turned, the other half of the strategy would have to withdraw as well. So at Salamis we can see that strategy employed again, because well, the narrows of the Salamis Strait are the last confined waters to confront the Persian fleet and to protect the isthmus of Corinth, which in turn was the last confined area where the Greek army could hope to fend off the Persian forces. So the Greek knew that when they got out of confined waters into open water, they would be annihilated pretty soon, because one, they were outnumbered, and that's always bad, and second, the Phoenicians were awfully good at their job, so it seems, and if you're in very fast ships, like the Phoenicians obviously were, since they won a race after the crossing of the Hellespont, which ship in the Persian fleet is the fastest, the ship of Sidon's king won that. So, well, you've got skill and numbers against you in open water, so you do not like that. So that's why even the Athenians agreed to leave Attica and go over to Salamis and fight their action there instead of sailing away or trying their luck from some position at the Isthmus of Corinth.
Okay, so effectively the Greeks are they know they're kind of at the, I guess they're on the back foot navally in general, and so that they're trying to exploit the home field advantages that they've got.
Exactly. And also, well, we can debate whether Herodotus makes that up or not so much, but also we've got some quite clever tinkering there ongoing from the Athenian commander Themistocles, who first had to deal with the problems that every Greek fleet of that period is awfully hampered by the fact that there's no real central command, and nearly every polis commander will have a say, and if one polis doesn't agree, it can simply sail away or go over to the Persians. So Themistocles had to actually use some clever rhetorics to actually keep the Greeks in place, and then sent over the teacher of his kids to Xerxes to announce that A, the Greeks wanted to run away the next morning, first thing, and B, Themistocles himself, would like to negotiate a settlement with the Persians and maybe switch sides. So Xerxes actually thought, well, last time at Artemisium the Greeks got away from me in the dark, so this time I'll deploy my fleet during the night, so I can catch up any little Greek ships that tries to escape during the night. And then, well, next morning they will all go up and desert, and maybe some Athenian triremes, which will be the bulk of the enemy's fleet, will actually switch sides, and, well, that will be a very great day for my navy without actually doing any serious fighting.
And then it doesn't. Yeah, and then it doesn't quite work out for him the way he thought it would.
Not really, no.
Okay, so then, I guess that leads on to when you've got the Persian fleet itself. So we've got the Greek fleet is made up of, as you say, all these various different city-states. In some ways, actually kind of reminds me of some of the early Dutch fleets in the first Anglo-Dutch wars, where you've got the 7 different Dutch states, and they're all arguing over exactly how they should fight, whilst they're actually at sea and almost in the middle of a fight. But when it came to the various Persian territories, I know we've said that it's usually the Phoenician vassal states that are making up the bulk of this navy. But with these various sort of Egyptian, Cyprus, Tyre, I guess, and the Ionian states, are their designs all pretty much of a muchness, pretty much the same, or are there slightly different styles? Is one state contributing maybe more triremes and another is more kind of the fast scouts?
Well, in that regard, I would guess that triremes are the bulk for the battle fleet from every location, regardless. Where we can see some difference, or at least presume some differences, is maybe some kind of building techniques, like you might have different ways to put together the hulls, and you might have slightly different materials, like in Egypt. Well, I think they must have imported the wood for their hulls, presumably from Phoenicia. And the Phoenicians themselves, they would presumably use cedar trees, for example, from the mountains of Lebanon to build their ships. That would be a slight difference to Greek ships built by Athens, where pine and oak would be primarily used. And also we've got some, well, very crude, rudimentary differences mentioned by Herodotus for the Battle of Salamis. For example, he mentions that the Persian ships would have been a little bit higher, whereas the Greek ships would have been heavier. So that could be explained for different reasons. First, the Greek ships might have been in action for longer without drying out. So if your trireme isn't dried out properly, you will naturally be heavier, so slower to row. Then the Athenians especially didn't have that much experience in building triremes, so maybe they, well, just didn't build them as good as some Phoenician guys, and that way they came out heavier. In terms of why the Persian ships are said to be higher, could be that quite a lot of them still preferred boarding actions instead of maneuver tactics, so you're a little bit at an advantage there if you're higher, and maybe also they carried more marines than free Greek counterparts. But I doubt that there were very distinguishable differences between those fleets, because we've got also the story from Salamis that the commanding officer for the fleet from Halicarnassus on the Persian side was the Queen Artemisia, and during the Battle of Salamis she was pursued by an Athenian ship and decided, my neighbor, she didn't like that guy anyhow, well, I'll ram him so that the Athenians will think, oh, she's on our side. And she got away with that, not only from the Athenians, that they left her alone, but after the battle, she was actually applauded for bravery by Xerxes, because that guy sat on his throne and saw, oh, that woman's ship has just rammed the trireme. Must have been a very enemy ship and a very brave maneuver from her. Yeah.
I guess they hadn't quite mastered the cunning art of battle flags to work out who was who at that point.
Then, like, during that engagement, there seems to have been some guys with Xerxes who at least claimed they could see and differentiate the ships, but such a battle line could be, maybe 3-4 miles long, and without binoculars or any other thing than the human eyeball, I think it will be very difficult to even see any kind of sign you could hoist.
Yeah. I suppose that's fair. Yeah. So when you've got all these ships sort of sailing around, rowing around, trying to ram each other, obviously the invasion of Greece. I mean, they moved troops across the Hellespont with, well, they tried at least with a boat bridge, for all that worked out for them. But obviously, we've said these ships could would usually carry a small number of marines. So, what kind of ships were used to move troops if you were going to do kind of a proper landing, or you're trying to move an army around? Would you use dedicated transport ships, or did they just kind of overload the warships for short distance transportation?
Both, actually. Like, for later expeditions of the Athenian navies, we have at least some mentions that Cimon, son of Miltiades, actually tried to get broader decks on Athenian triremes and put on more marines, like 40 instead of 10 guys. So that would enhance your capabilities. Also, you could simply overload the warships or take some older triremes, put on not so many rowers, and put marines or landing forces in their place. Like, if you're a landing fleet, you don't need to be that fast. You will hopefully have a contingent of ships to help you fend off enemy warships. But also you needed to build specialized transports if you wanted to transport cavalry. So for the campaign of Darius against Athens, which led to the Battle of Marathon, we know that he ordered the building of Kai Ipagoga Ploiai, that's horse transports. And that needed to be specially constructed. We do not know how that ships looked like, but since he specifically ordered his vassal cities to build them, and we know that he landed cavalry at Marathon, or at least tried to before the Athenians came, that must have been a thing. For the Greeks, well, they rarely deployed cavalry, and I do not think that they ever tried to do a full-scale invasion by sea using both cavalry and infantry in that numbers. But yeah, you could presumably also turn older triremes to hold some horses if you liked to, and you found some poor guys to row that damn things, but those are fragile ships, and you even do not want your marines to move about too much on top in battle, so I wouldn't want to see a horse trampling around such a deck.
Yeah, they're not the world's most stable craft.
Definitely not.
Yeah. So once the Persians had kind of been seen off, you have this sort of inter-war period, I guess, between the Persians giving up on their main attempts to invade Greece, and then obviously later on when Alexander the Great decides it'd be really nice to return the favour. But in that intervening period, the Greeks decided it would be a really good idea to fight each other, with various leagues being formed. So how did they end up turning the expertise that they gained in the Persian wars on each other, and did that hand a particular advantage to perhaps the Greek city-states that had done most of the naval fighting, or did the others also kind of absorb the lessons pretty quickly?
Well, at first it's a full advantage to Athens, really, because Athens comes out of the war not only with the biggest navy of its day, at least for a Greek city, but also it forms its core league, the Delian-Attican League, and within that league they would either compel the member cities to send ships or to send money. And pretty damn sure they made clear that they preferred money, because when Athens got the money, they could control the ships directly, no risk of deserting allies, and they also needed the money to pay for the democracy, basically because your Thetis is now a full-fledged citizen of Athens with full political rights, which means you can sit in court. But if you sit in courts for a day with 500 other Thetis, you can't work, so you need to be paid for that damn thing. So Athens' democracy pretty soon depends on the cash inflow from the Delian Attican League. So that intermingles with the Athenian theory, like we need the sea to keep democracy and vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
And for Sparta and its League of Corinth, it's pretty much not that they discard the lessons, but, well, Sparta only deployed like 10 warships for Salamis or so they didn't learn that awfully much and relied on the land armies more. But, well, in the Peloponnesian Wars, you've got that very interesting conundrum that Athens had used to be evacuated against invading forces by land, like they did against the Persians, but now they have built the connection walls to the harbor and could defend that walls and basically act like an island on land. So that the Spartans would march to Attica, raid the countryside, and, well, couldn't do anything against the Athenians behind the walls, whilst the Athenian fleet would happily sail around the Peloponnesian Peninsula, raid every coastal city they liked, and set up some forts as anchor points and to attract fleeing slaves, helots, from Sparta. That thing changed through two things mainly. First, Athens for some reason thought, well, brilliant idea, we are fighting already with the League of Corinth. Let's sail our fleet all the way to Sicily and invade Syracuse, which is basically as big as we are, but if we conquer them, we'll definitely have the upper hand against Sparta. Didn't turn out that well because, well, the Spartans also had the Corinthians as allies. Those guys were pretty big in sailory as well and helped Syracuse to fend off the Athenian navy also by applying a little bit of innovation. Like before that time, you had to ram an enemy's ship on the broadside or the stern. Bow and bow ramming would simply lead to both ships sinking because, well, you caved in your ship as well. But the Corinthians strengthened their ships' bows so that they can ram bow on, the Athenians don't. Pretty soon the Athenians learn that trick as well, but that's a rare bit of innovation that we can see and still trace down for that time period. And, well, I talked a lot about money from the Athenians coming in, and that's also the trick that does it, at least for their downfall, because the Spartans, which are thought to be very rich guys, in the first place decide to talk to the Persians. And, well, the Persians still have quite the grudge against Athens. For some reason.
Shockingly,
yeah. And, well, the Persians say, okay, infighting in Greek is just what we want, and finance a fleet for Sparta. And when Sparta gets that money in, they can have both their army and that nice little big fleet. And, well, then that's actually conundrum for Athens, and everything ends in turmoil. Athens gets back from the loss of the Peloponnesian War quite well and quite quickly, while Sparta just decides, well, yes, we've won, the fleet really wasn't our thing, let's let that water away and we'll do battle on land, that's better for us.
So it kind of, yeah, so the advantage shifts away from Athens, but then by the end of the war, it's gone back to Athens mainly through apathy from everybody else that they fought.
Yeah, that's after the war,
yeah.
Sparta wins that war actually, and for a short time Athens isn't a democracy any longer, but then, well, that goes away pretty quickly, and we've got the second league of Attica and Delian province.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so obviously we've mentioned that the Syracuse campaign and the Corinthian advances in how to ram head on. Were there any other differences with the intercity fighting between the Greek states that was different to fighting the Persians? And you kind of get the impression, at least on the surface, that fighting the Persians was kind of these sort of large fleets sort of poking around, hoping that one or the other would make a critical mistake. Was there kind of this big fleet engagement in the various wars between the Greek states, or was it more sort of squadrons and flotillas of ships and sort of smaller scale fighting?
Well, both actually. You've got quite large engagements, like in the harbor of Syracuse, where we are talking like maybe 10, 20, 25,000 people on each side. So that's quite the big battles for ancient times, at least. But since the Peloponnesian Wars, at least, are quite longer than, well, the odd invasion of some big Persian army, we also have quite a lot of squadron fighting on smaller scale. So like maybe 10, 20, 25 ships on each side. And that would be where the Athenians, at least in the first parts of the war, would excel, because they had more experience in doing naval battles. And so that's the first thing. The scale would be different. The second, well, we can at least assume, or we would like to assume, that there was a little difference in actually the conduct of fighting, because, well, you don't have an invasion force from a foreign country, but really, if the Athenians learned something from the Persians, then that if you want to keep your allies, you'll have to threaten them awfully good, so that they remain your allies instead of going over to the other side. So they're just equally as brutal as any Persian army would have been, and the Spartans don't give in that way also. So no, we can't really say that there is difference there. I already mentioned the bow and bow ramming, and well, later, a short time before Alexander, we'll see some shipborne artillery coming in, at least for defending cities, if not for stationing on board warships, but that's really it. So the bulk of the fighting of Salamis would have looked pretty convincing to an admiral who sailed into the harbor of Syracuse a few decades later.
So that brings us, I guess, to the last question in this particular video, which is, what happened to the Greek fleets between this last period of intercity fighting and the rise of Alexander the Great? Because, but when you see his campaigns, again, at least on a surface reading, you get the impression that an awful lot of the fleet that sort of follows him down and around and all over the place is made up of Phoenician vessels that he and other Persian satrapies that he's conquered. So were the Greek fleets kept? Was there a Greek fleet that he used, at least at first, or was it kind of just left to go all rot away?
Okay, so in the beginning, when his father, Philip II of Macedon, really laid the foundations for a Macedonian state in northern Greece, which could lead to the conquest of his son, he had to deal with Athens, and Athens still had its navy, so Athens could threaten the Macedonian coast and resupply colony cities on the coast. That would be the main goal for the Athenian navy. There was also, during that time, established a small Macedonian navy, but that really didn't see any major battles, because, well, the other Greek city-states had better and larger navies at their disposal. We see at some point that Macedon captures an entire grain fleet of ships from Greek city-states that try to carry in grain from the Black Sea down to Athens and other cities. But that might have been an encounter like the fleet was rounded up somewhere in the Bosporus region, more or less near shore, and the Macedonians just rode out and got their ships off them. When we are talking about Alexander's campaigns themselves, we can see some use of his fleet during his first Balkan campaign up north for crossing the Danube and getting in contact with some guys who were trapped on an island. And later for his big voyage or conquering tour to the Persians, he has a fleet supplied by his own fleet, ships and Athenian vessels and some other Greek states, so they were still active, but not used very much. And at some point during his stay in Asia Minor, Alexander decides that this fleet is awfully expensive to keep up, and he could use that money elsewhere, and well, they wouldn't be as strong as the Persians anyhow, so he just tells them to go home and does the rest of the trick with his army by simply conquering the Persian strongholds which could resupply the Persian fleet. That is, well, the quite surprising encounter, because in theory the Persians could have done all funny things with going around the Aegean with their naval supremacy and just conquering Greek islands and city-states in Alexander's rear, but that doesn't happen too much, partly because the Persian commander who would have done such things dies, fortunately for Alexander, and then he conquers quite a lot of Phoenician cities, as he mentions, and they supply him with a new fleet to do siege of Tyre. Later we also see one, or at least two new shipbuilding programs from Alexander. The first is in the Indus region, when he constructs a new fleet, mans it, and well, leads or at least orders an expedition into the Arabian Sea and following his course on land. And then the second one is shortly before his death in Mesopotamia, so on the Euphrates and Tigris River. Also a fleet was in construction there, presumably to conquer Arabia later on, but that didn't really catch up. But here, the Greek city-states still kept their navies, and it's only in that period that we see the switch from 3-rowed warships to 4-5 rowers. And, well, after that it gets to the period that you've got some smaller city-states with their navies, Athens, for example, or Rhodes, but also the big Hellenistic empires like the Seleucids or the Ptolemies, which built very large fleets of large ships, but that's when the territory ends for city-states, because, well, your typical city-state isn't even Athens, but more like, well, 1,000 guys bunched up on some hill near the sea, and, well, you can man 2-3 triremes, but that's it, and you can't compete with that numbers any longer.
Okay, so yeah, there's a fair bit more naval development going on then than just your, let's say, the standard narrative that you might read in a sort of a brief history of the period. Okay, well that's a very interesting little section that we've done there about. Let's try that last bit again. Didn't know where I was going with that. Okay, so that's quite an interesting section there on the naval combat in the Greco-Persian Wars, and, well, then the, I guess, Greco-on-Greco Wars, the Peloponnesian Wars, which helped fill in some of the naval development from the period sort of way back in, well, not prehistory, but even further back, ancient history, and then getting up towards the period where you'd start to have naval artillery involved. So thank you very much for lending us your expertise and in this particular field, and hopefully we will talk again at some point about other ancient naval battles, and I hope everyone else has enjoyed it as much as I have.
Certainly. Glad that you had me, and, well, get in contact if you like to talk about more stuff of ancient navies.
Yeah. And
that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.